Hi, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining for the July edition of Conservation Conversations. We have a great program ahead for you. We welcome you to type your name in the chat and let us know where you're joining from today. We'll get started in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Rehr, and I'm the Director of Climate Policy and Justice for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. I'm joined today for our July edition of Conservation Conversations by a trio of guests that I am very pleased to welcome. First, we have Victoria Venable, Director of Government Relations for Frederick County. Welcome, Victoria. We also have Matt Kropp, who's the Director of the Department of Planning and Zoning in Harford County. Hi, Matt. And Jennifer Macedonia, the Director of the Department of Environmental Protection in Montgomery County. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here today. Our topic this month could not be more timely. Data centers are emerging as one of the most consequential economic development, infrastructure, and land use issues facing Maryland counties. Today, we'll hear how those three counties are approaching this topic. Maryland LCV works primarily at the state level, and we've hosted prior conversations about data center policies and what we have done to advocate for protections through the legislative process, like in the 2026 Utility Relief Act, which included adjustments to the large load tariff, which is the special electricity rate for large load users like data centers, a large load registry to avoid the double or triple counting of projected data center load across the PJM grid, which had disastrous impacts on our utility bills. And if you ever want to talk PJM, it's a whole nother episode and a whole nother conversation, but give me a call. And incentives to bring for data centers to bring their own clean energy generation. This edition of Conservation Conversations is a fresh perspective for our audience and is being produced in collaboration with the Maryland Association of Counties, or MACO. We are grateful for their partnership and hope to see our guests and some of our audience at their summer conference in a few weeks in Ocean City, when Maryland LCV will be participating in a plenary session on this very topic. So I'm taking notes as our guests speak today. So let's dig in. And we had a record-breaking number of questions from our audience as part of the registration process for this conversation. So I want to start by actually with some of those questions, because we got a lot of clarifying questions about the scale of data center projects that we're talking about. And I'm just going to read some of those questions so we can level set for today's conversation. So when we talk about data centers, we understand the scale and type of project we're talking about. So I'm going to combine questions we got from Ruth and from Michelle. And so can we hear a clear explanation for why these data centers have to be so large? Why do they consume so much electricity? Why do they need so much water? And sort of like a corollary to that, are there different types and sizes of data centers? What are the minimum and maximum property size and infrastructure energy requirements for data centers? That's a combo of a lot of questions, but I really thought it was important to tee up the conversation that we're going to get to in a minute about your county's data center policies, to talk about what kind of data center what we're talking about, the scale we're talking about. So give us a sense of the scale of these projects, and anyone can start here. All right, Victoria, you want to jump in?
All right, I'll jump in. So I'll start with that last question about, are there different types and are there different sizes? There certainly are. And in fact, in Frederick County, we have had two legacy data centers for over 20 years in our community. I believe there's over 40 across the state of Maryland, but those are often what I would call those legacy data centers that are, much smaller than some of the projects we're seeing proposed today. So, today we are seeing such an increase in the computing needs in our economy, in our social lives, in the way businesses and organizations work. I mean, we're all sitting on a webinar right now. But we also are seeing the proliferation of AI and Pretty much every daily function that we do requires some computing. So that's one of the reasons there's such a significant demand. As for the resource use and the needs of data centers, when you think about sort of a computer lab, many of us probably learned to type or use a search engine in a computer lab, and those rooms got hot because computers are emitting so much heat. And most of the resources in the work that we've done and we've seen are used because of the cooling requirements and the needs that are related to that computing needs. So we see, obviously, there's a lot of electricity generation or consumption, as well as water consumption for the cooling needs. I will say, at least in Frederick County, the water is not, brought in from a drilled well. It's something that it goes through our public process. So I can talk more about that later. But that's part of why they're using so much of those resources.
Jennifer, Matt, the state now defines a large load as 25 megawatts, and that's down from a previous definition of 100 megawatts. Is that how your county, are you using that state definition?
Yeah, I'll go next, Rebecca. I think that was a good introduction, and by the way, thank you so much for including us today on this webinar. So in Montgomery County, we certainly have what folks might consider data centers that are smaller in size, server banks, hospitals, things that maybe fit in a room of a building or one floor of a building. These are much smaller than what we're now focused on, which are the hyperscale data centers that require, much more energy and water, as Victoria mentioned. And yes, just yesterday, Montgomery County actually passed some important, definitions that are relevant for our conversation today. And in particular, Montgomery County defined a new definition of data center that will guide zoning regulations and so forth going forward. And it sets a minimum threshold of 25 megawatts. And that's kind of the energy demand threshold, which these hyperscale data centers are kind of known by their energy demand. And the definition also, talks about the buildings that are used to house the equipment, the servers and so forth that store, manage, process, and transmit data. And the definition also has some exclusions that are specific to facilities primarily used for either medical care, research, manufacturing, educational purposes, and so forth. So that's how we're viewing it in Montgomery County. I think it's very helpful to have leadership from the state. So we have a common language around this, but I think different counties are looking at it for their own local priorities. Just to mention, in terms of what the county passed yesterday, they also passed an 18-month moratorium on accepting, processing, or approving data centers, and that builds on an earlier 6-month moratorium from the county executive last month that was specific as well. So this is kind of our bridge to give us the time to think through these issues, make sure we do it right. We're more focused on getting it right than we are on being first on this one, because we understand pretty significant impacts are possible. We've heard a lot of concerns from our community, and we'll get to that, I think, in a moment. But that's where things currently stand. Happy to dig in further as we go on.
Thanks, Jennifer. Matt, anything to add on the scale of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so I think Harford County actually became the first county in Maryland to just ban the use itself of a data center. So I think originally when we're looking at the definition, we were looking at scale, and then I think it was decided and amended to reflect just the use, and the definition itself got changed again to reflect that desire. So we don't have a specific criteria for the scale, but we have effectively banned data centers in all zoning districts in Harford County.
Got it. And I think some of the things you said is important level setting for the conversation. And Victoria, the image you used of a computer lab in high school, is really vivid for me. I, kind of had a flashback. It was the only room in my high school that was air conditioned. And now I sort of remember that was that, everybody wanted to take computer class because it was the air conditioned room in the school. I went to Baltimore City Public Schools, shout out Polly. But it was at the time the only air conditioned room, and it's because you're right, computers get hot. And the other thing I want to pick up on is that data centers have been around for a long time as a concept, a room with computers, so that we could use the internet. The example I always use is, my kid is in daycare. There's an app. I use the app to check him in and check him out for security purposes. They also send super cute pictures of him throughout the day, and I love that. But that can all really be done at this, this kind of use is why there was a floor in a building. But it's really this AI and generative AI development and the changes in how we're using computing technologies that have presented the need for the what we're calling now the hyperscale data centers, which are these much larger footprint buildings. So that's important context. So we started to talk about it already, but let's get into the specific policies that each of your counties has. Each county represented here has a different policy on data centers. And Jennifer, you started to talk about your policy, and I promise we didn't plan it this way, although it worked out just yesterday. The county council voted on an 18-month moratorium. So anything else you want to say about Montgomery County's data center policy?
Yeah, thank you. Exciting moment in the county. Again, we've been thinking actively about this. There's been a few bills, and this is the council speaking out to provide some time to make sure we get this right. And there's been a lot of topics that have come up that we want to think about getting the guardrails in place before we have these hyperscale data centers development in our county. So just to mention, along with the 18-month moratorium, there's the separate bill, which, as I mentioned, formally defines data centers. And this is specifically related to their land use in our county zoning. And so as part of that, it also prohibits the development of data centers in all zones for the time being. Now, again, that's not necessarily considered a permanent ban. It's intended as a bridge to a longer term policy. This is going to provide the time for us to build the guardrails that we believe are necessary. And specifically, the county council, the county executive, we've already been identifying specific issues that we want to explore and consider requirements for. So specifically, we're talking about energy, water, noise, visual impacts, other costs to residents, and environmental and quality of life issues that I know many other counties are looking at as well.
Got it. And yeah, the state too is actually in the process of a data center study. That was a bill that passed in 2025, was vetoed and then overturned. The veto was overridden. And so the state is currently doing a study that I believe is due out in September. I know they were slightly delayed in starting because of that process I just mentioned, so maybe October, but coming out soon as well. The state is going to put out the results of its data center study.
We're very much looking to that as well. I think there's a real role for state leadership here and some continuity across the state and other states as well.
Yeah, and Matt, you also alluded already to Harford County's recent ban on data centers. So do you want to talk a little bit more about the policy itself?
Yeah, so how it essentially worked was there were rumblings of a data center a few come into the county. Some unofficial presentations were made. Then the county council knew that under our zoning code, if it's not something that is listed specifically, the use it's deemed prohibited. The director can look for materially similar uses if applicable. As a director here, I didn't feel that we really had anything that was materially similar. Of course, I wasn't officially ever asked because nothing officially actually came in. I think there was a fear from the county council that something could change. It started with a proposed moratorium on this issue, and then to quote set guardrails on data center development. And then our administration felt that we should just go ahead and ban this. We did the research. We looking at Maryland's energy policy, looking at the usage, looking at the environmental consequences to data center development. We just felt it wasn't really in Harford County's best interest. Economically, not a lot of jobs are created for data centers. Maryland is in a shortfall for energy, and then we were warned by BGE last year of rolling brownouts and other issues. So we just felt that let's go ahead and do this and essentially ban that use in all zoning districts.
Thanks, Matt. And Victoria, I think it is, you mentioned in your opening some legacy data center. I think it's probably safe to say Frederick County is probably the county in Maryland that's been thinking about this the longest.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
And I'll do my best to keep this as brief as possible, but we're talking about a 7+ year history here. So our story really starts back in 2019, 2020, in a very similar place to what Matt just spoke about, where our use table did not have anything defining what a data center is and where it could go. So, but we were hearing that there was interest. Now we are uniquely situated very close to Loudoun County, which is the data center capital of the world. And that made us very attractive to data centers. And we don't have any incentives. We didn't really court them to come to our community, but we knew that they were looking for opportunities. And so prior to my boss's administration and this current county council, the previous county council did pass legislation to add that as a use and permit it to be anywhere in industrial land. Now, it's fascinating to me just from a sociological and political science viewpoint. That was in 2022, and the bill passed unanimously with our county council. There was very, very little, I think, zero public opposition to that legislation. It was, it created some guardrails. It did create some initial livability requirements and design requirements, but it was a completely different conversation than what we're seeing today. So flash forward into the current administration, when Frederick County Executive Jessica Fitzwater was elected, we established a data center work group and spent a little shy of 2 years working on studying this industry. So it was a pretty broad group of environmental advocates, agricultural, business, labor, industry leaders, like across the board. We spent a little shy of 2 years doing a very public work group process. We did use a moratorium at that time as well. So I think it's a great use of pausing applications, pausing consideration of this industry while you were deliberating on the policy, because you want to make sure that your subject matter experts and your policymakers can work in that space without the pressure of those projects. And so we got through that process, and ultimately through a couple of bills, we've established the most regulations on any industry in our community. And based off of conversations I've had with many other jurisdictions across the country, certainly more robust guardrails than most jurisdictions have on the books so far. So, we're talking about lighting and sound and vibration requirements. So, trying to get at the concerns that neighbors may have. We also have some performance standard requirements when it comes to backup generation for backup generators and diesel generators. We ultimately, one of the biggest questions that we heard discussed and knew we needed to answer was, where should they go and where shouldn't they go? Ultimately, the 2022 bill just said any industrial land. It became very clear very quickly that that was too broad. We learned from a lot of our peers in Loudoun County that letting data centers have a by right use on any industrial land, they had it as commercial land. Even industrial by right created some big concerns for us because that could be in many different parts of our county. And we wanted to make sure that we reduced that to an upper limit, restricted how many could be in our community, while also giving some certainty to our community, certainty to the actual businesses that are investing in this industry. So we used what's called a zoning overlay to further limit that land to that's available to data center development to less than 0.6% of county land. So concentrating it right around the existing development. So many of you have probably heard about the Quantum Frederick project. That's what ultimately was approved in 2022 during that legislative process. And it's at an abandoned industrial site. Was a former aluminum smelting plant. So if you're thinking about this infrastructure, that's where it belongs. It belongs in places where it's not going to utilize additional green space or agricultural land. We want to make sure it's in a place that makes sense. So we drew basically a circle around that existing project and said, this is where it's permitted to be. We also adopted requirements to require developers to invest in agricultural preservation. So if there was any upzoning, so zoning up to industrial use, it's a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every acre that is used for data center development, we are investing resources into preserving 5 acres of agricultural preservation. We also worked with several different executive orders to pause throughout this process because this was a 3+ year process to get all of these regulations in place. And then currently we do have an executive order pausing the acceptance of applications because we are very interested in the study that the state is doing and want to make sure we have the opportunity to regulate further on that should there be any recommendations that we think are necessary for local action. And then finally, I will say, we were really pleased to see some of the work that was done in the Utility Relief Act. There were a lot of recommendations in our data center work group that touched on policy issues outside of the county purview. And so we've been advocating to the state to take on some of those issues, things like energy and air quality regulations. So very excited that there'll be some research coming from the impact study, but also the large load registry, I think, is a really important move on the state level. So we are now requiring those registrations to come to the county during our development review process, because although we can't regulate energy, we do think it's an important piece of the equation as our planning commission and development review team is looking over those applications. So a lot happening, and I tried to get it as synthesized as possible, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you. And through each of your answers, you started to bring up what you're hearing from residents. What are you hearing from county residents, as you make these decisions? We've heard about where should these go. We've heard about energy use, water use. So I want to hear a little bit more sort of like, what is the top thing you hear from your residents? I'm curious to see whether it's the same across the 3 counties or whether actually you're hearing quite different things. So I'm curious. And then if the top thing you're hearing is not environment, it's something else, like not environment related, please do also talk a little bit about some of the top environmental concerns you're hearing from residents, because that's certainly what we get from our audience and what we work on. So Matt, why don't we start with you? What are you hearing from Harford County residents? What's the concern that's like bubbling up to the top? And if it's not environment, what's the top environmental concern?
Okay. So I guess the elected officials would probably be the best to answer that. So our department, we definitely heard loud and clear, not in Harford County. We don't want data centers in Harford County. It doesn't fit with our master plan. Specifically where one was being proposed, it was in an ag area outside of any growth area. And again, when I say proposed, it was being discussed. Nothing actually officially was submitted. So there was a lot of concern, and rightfully so, of the change in the character. But I would say energy usage was probably, the fear of rates going up even more than they have was probably the number one. And then top environmental issue would be water concerns, and whether that be, um, you know, if you're on a private well, uh, the impact that these data centers could have on your individual well, and of course, if there was an incident, a fire, other kind of emergency response, what chemicals are going to be used to make sure uh, that the fire is extinguished, and then what's left after that, like what's going to happen to the groundwater. There's a lot of concern environmentally with groundwater concerns, but also, again, streams and impacts to the environment. They certainly were in the top running as well for environmental.
Got it. Victoria, why don't you pick us up? You've been hearing from residents for a long time. What's the top thing people are concerned about, and what's the top environmental thing if it's not?
Well, I would say it's definitely evolved over time. And it's also a little bit different across the county. So Frederick
Mm.
County is the largest landmass county in the state. And so we have different pockets of communities across our community. In our experience, it definitely depends where that community is, what type of feedback we're getting. Near the campus, we hear a lot of concerns that are very consistent with complaints we hear around any large construction project. So keep in mind, while we started this project in 2022, it's still a construction project. We're just now getting some of the actual data centers plugged in and turned on and all of that good stuff. But it is still an active construction project. So we hear about construction noise, road and traffic impacts, livability concerns, and air pollution. The diesel generators are used for backup because many of these data centers are for critical digital infrastructure. And so that means that they are required by federal law to always have power backup. That means there's a lot of concern and warranted concern around the pollution that comes out of diesel generators. We required tier 4 compliant generators, which is the highest standard with the EPA for emissions. But even that, I know people are very concerned about that if they live close by. Countywide, I would say we hear more about general distrust for the industry, general concern about, as Matt was saying, sort of the impacts to the full county's character. Agricultural preservation is certainly a big concern we've heard. And then more so within the last year, concerns around energy impacts and electricity costs because of this industry. And that's because of the industry nationwide, not just here in Frederick County. As you know very well, if they're on the PJM grid, there's an impact for all of us. And so it's hard to disperse that out for our projects, projects in Loudoun County.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is something that's starting to keep me up at night a little bit, is, sort of Maryland LCV, we've started to do a lot of more work geared towards PJM and the decisions they're making and their governance structure that directly affects our rates. And we, one thing to consider is that if there's a data center, so PJM is going through a process right now to try to parse out how much of the potential energy demand across the grid is actually coming from data centers. And then the states will actually be able to charge the data centers for that anticipated demand so that it doesn't fall on ratepayers. But that requires a specific process at PJM, and it requires that each state has the law to take the information from PJM and then allocate the large load tariff to the data center. And so, to be clear, and Maryland did that. We did it in the Utility Relief Act. But if, for example, another state on PJM didn't do the state law process, Marylanders could still end up paying, our electricity rates could go up for the data center in that state, no matter what our state policy is on data centers. And so that is something that's starting to, when you wake up at 5 a.m., like, I gotta work on that. That's one of those things that we're thinking critically about. And we might get into with the one of the future questions. But Jennifer, what are you hearing from Montgomery County residents about data centers?
Yeah, thanks. I will build on very similar themes as that you've all brought up, because we're hearing similar things. First of all, we are hearing a lot of public input about data centers. So it is something that has people's attention. We've done a forum, and we're going to be, we we're trying to make sure we're doing a lot of meaningful engagement, but we're definitely hearing it's mostly focused on concerns. I think similar to what you're suggesting about PJM and electricity rates, sort of the issue of rising utility bills, associated with the large energy demand of these facilities, I think might kind of rise to the top. But that we are also hearing quite a bit about environmental and quality of life impacts, groundwater impacts, similar to what Matt mentioned, noise pollution, greenhouse gas pollution, obviously the large energy demand. And as we are building out, increasing demand kind of faster than we can supply clean electricity, I think there's a lot of concern about what this does to the stability of climate and all of the climate impacts that we're already very much seeing and exacerbating that. Energy reliability, blackouts, concerns about that. If it's built in our county, but also if it's built in our region and PJM, because we share a grid. I think, as Matt mentioned, we're also seeing some general opposition to the proliferation of AI just in general, and that, the associated job loss and other potential downsides. But I do want to say that not everyone in Montgomery County is opposed to data centers. Obviously, we all are using data in our lives, and we do realize that there are going to be data centers to support all of that data that we are using in our daily lives and our work and so forth. And whether it's in the county or in the region, there are some of these impacts. So some of the, state level, PJM level considerations, I think are worth, thinking through, because even if it's not in our county, that doesn't mean we're not going to see some of these impacts. So there are some who say maybe it's better to have it in our county, because then we know we can do it with the appropriate guardrails and make sure it is done well. So that's another thing that we're thinking about.
And
can I jump in on one thing there?
Go for it.
Just on the better where they go if they're going to exist. I mean, the thing that keeps me up at night right now is the states like West Virginia just passed legislation last year that preempts all of their local governments from doing any of the things that we are doing here in Maryland to mitigate some of the risks. Some counties want to do full bans, permanent bans. West Virginia legislature just preempted all of that and basically arms wide open. And when you think about the cumulative impacts of our full community, it scares me when you think about if we see all of these data centers run to communities where there aren't regulations, like what does that mean for the rest of us?
Mm-hmm. And is there any concern? I mean, are people bringing up tax, revenues, potential lost revenues if data centers aren't, for example, West Virginia? I'm not suggesting we preempt all local laws here, but like if that means that West Virginia is going to get a windfall of data centers, does that also mean they get the tax revenues from that? And Maryland does it. It is an argument I hear, for example, in Annapolis all the time in other types of businesses. It's interesting how the script sort of flipped on this one a little bit. Anyway, maybe that's just food for thought. So, so last question I have, I have a few audience questions that I want to try to get to. So maybe this last one can be quick answers, but you all work at the county level and have gone over your county level policies. What do you need from the state? You've talked a little bit about it's nice to have state, consistent definitions, from the state level, consistency on the large load registry and energy, where the state can, regulate air quality and things like that. But what do you need? Name one. Let's do this. Name one thing. What do you need from the state as you think about your county's data center policy? Jennifer, let's start with you.
So I think first up, we want the state to lead on this issue. We want them to have a framework to guide the development of data centers in Maryland. And that includes, the economic, energy, and environmental impacts. And so we are going through all of the concerns, that we've raised, and particularly on the environmental side, the water issues, the energy, air pollution, climate issues, noise, and so forth. We have recommended solutions, guardrails around all of those things. And if we need to, we're prepared to put them in place at the county level, but we actually think it's best to do it at the state level. So for all of the solutions that we're recommending, we would like the state to take action on that and to lead. And frankly, we care about the region as well. We mentioned, I've mentioned all the regional impacts of these things on PJM. So we want leadership from the state. We're concerned about rising energy costs. We're concerned about the significant environmental impacts. The Potomac River supplies water for the region, and we are experiencing drought and have high risks associated with the river, sensitive ecosystem. So we want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we put guardrails in place on all of these important topics.
Thanks. Matt, what do you need to see from the state on this?
Well, I think that we feel that data centers are on a collision course really with Maryland's green energy policy. For all the reasons that we just talked about with PJM and everything else, I think we feel strongly here at the county that as much as we understand the desire to have green energy, when you have uses like this, there's a conflict. And to expect that Maryland, I think the goal is within 7 years to have 100% energy from green energy sources. I think it's unrealistic, and to have proposals for data centers that say, "Oh, we're not going to use certain types. We're going to tap in directly to natural gas," say, for example. I don't think that that's equitable or fair that they would be able to do that for their use, and residents have to pay increased rates. So I think, in short, I really think the state, as much as helpful as they want to be, they should stay out of local zoning and leave home rule zoning decisions to local governments. I think that would be the most useful thing they can do, and consider revising their policies for energy to make energy more affordable and for everyone.
Thanks, Matt. I saw a applause, an agreement from across the counties on the stay out of local zoning, and I think we'll have a deeper conversation maybe another day on the state's clean energy policies and the opportunity to build out the grid, an emissions-free grid in a way that is both affordable and can meet energy demand. And that's going to require data center companies to be a bigger player in that energy future. These are not mom and pop data center shops. These are companies that can, that there could be an opportunity to build a clean energy economy through this type of development. But that's why I think a lot of folks are pausing to think that through. So appreciate that. Victoria, I want to close us out on what the state, what you've talked about Frederick County advocating with the state. So what do you need to see from the state?
Yeah, so a lot of things that have already been said about leading, but the one thing I'll say that hasn't been said yet is we at the county level really want additional taxing authority, particularly for this industry. So counties in Maryland can't assess different property types at different tax rates. So when we set a property tax, it has to apply across the board. And municipalities have the ability to set different rates for different subclasses of property tax. We would love to be able to do that because, frankly, it doesn't make sense for an industry like data centers to be paying the same property tax rate as our residents or even other commercial users. Additionally, and we've been advocating for that for several years, and we will continue to do so. And then additionally, Frederick County hasn't offered any tax incentives or tax breaks of any sort, but there is still a state exemption for sales and use tax for data centers. And I think if we are going to be providing any sort of incentive, at the very least, it needs to be tied to performance standards. If we have a carrot, we should have a little bit of a stick here. And we're leaving money on the table. As you said, these are certainly not mom and pop shop data centers. So they don't need the incentives. Let's make them do something for them if we're going to have them.
Appreciate that. I want to end with a question that we got from the audience. I'm going to read it as it was submitted, and you can answer it then as you interpret it. But I think it kind of gets at a couple themes here and some of the chatter I've seen in the chat today. But that I'm going to read it as we got it. Data center opposition tends to be vocal and well organized, similar to NIMBY dynamics. So it's often the loudest voice in public comment periods and hearings. But there's likely a silent middle, people who are indifferent or even supportive, who don't show up to comment because the issue isn't salient to them, or because voicing support for something contentious carries social cost. How do counties distinguish between the public we hear from and the public as a whole when public comment is skewed one way? Are there other methods being used to capture the quieter majority rather than just weighting decisions based on who shows up to speak? This seems like a thread, on many types of infrastructure. And, the counties generally do a really good job, I think, on having, public hearings and hearing from constituents and, but I've seen some things in the chat about, I feel one way, but my commissioners are indifferent. So how do you approach public comment? How are you approaching what you're hearing, from people who show up, and then maybe trying to get input from people who don't? So that's a kind of a broad question, but something we're definitely seeing with the data center conversation. I know we're running up against time. I see my team warning me, but each of you are definitely going to get a chance to answer this, and then we'll close out. Victoria, start us off.
Okay. You're right. It's an age-old question here. We hear, whether you want to call them squeaky wheels or NIMBYs or concerned constituents. I mean, they're all true. We have all different perspectives, and it's our job to listen to all of them. And that means being as accessible and available as possible. We've had many, many public hearings and a very public process for this. That doesn't mean everybody likes the final decision that was made, but it's changed a lot over the course of this engagement. When we first started this, we had maybe 30 people in the room at our first couple of public hearings. If we held one today, it would be jam-packed full and overflowing. So I think it's just continuing to hold those public engagement opportunities. We are about to hold 2 open houses, which are a different format than we've used. There's not going to be as much public comment, but there's more of an opportunity for conversation. So we're having all of our regulatory agencies within county government there to talk about what their part in regulating this industry is, and then actually engaging in conversation and discussion with our constituents, because it is hard to do that in a public hearing setting. So trying to get information, trying to provide as many different formats and different opportunities is crucial. I mean, that's the name of the game in local government. You have to be accessible and responsive.
Yeah, I'll jump in next if that makes sense. I would agree with much of what Victoria said, and then just add to that. As one of the most diverse counties in the country, Montgomery County, we have an extra focus on making sure and taking the time and working through a variety of outreach opportunities to make sure that our decisions are made for all of our residents, and that we are doing both the engagement and considering all of the different viewpoints. And that is part of what the county council, relied on in asking for an 18-month moratorium. Is we need more time at the county leadership level to engage with residents. We have been hearing a lot about data centers, and particularly, we've got some vocal advocates and so forth, but we want to make sure that we can better understand all of the perspectives around the county and translate those into effective policy.
Thanks. Matt, how do you take public input and process all that information?
Yeah, so the main way is through the county council process. The public hearing for the ban was so well attended. It spilled out into the streets. I mean, the emails that were coming in, the Facebook groups that were formed, it was very, very clear. Very, very few people suggested they maybe data centers weren't so bad. Very, very high percentage didn't want them in this county, supported the ban. So yeah, that's the process. I agree with Victoria. County should be flexible with how we continue to evolve with technology on taking input. But all that was very clear for this position, for this issue in our county.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I think I've seen a request in the chat for to circulate to the audience the different policies that we've talked about today, which I think are public information. I think the policies that are in place are public information. So I think I have at least one. We'll make sure we have that documentation so we can share that with the audience, because people are interested in reading the definitions and reading the policies that each of your counties has put in place. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this conversation, this is a continued conversation. I'm so glad we were able to give the perspective to our audience, who we usually talk with on state level policies, the different perspectives from around the state and what different counties are doing on this topic. So I just really appreciate your time today. Our audience has been very robust in the chat. We'll try to gather the questions. If there's anything specific that we got for any of you, we'll forward them to you. And then what we're going to try to do at Maryland LCV Education Fund is package some of the questions together and post a blog or other resource page in the coming weeks that folks can reference as they have questions about data centers. And I think, we can definitely look forward to this question coming up in the 2027 session in one way or another. So please join us again on August 26th for our next conservation conversation on electric school buses. So that's our topic for next month as folks head back to school around that time. But until then, please enjoy what's left of the summer. And thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Rebecca.